In the sharing ministry last Sunday, we talked about loving our neighbor and about how hard it's become to love our neighbor when we are so politically divided. I had this little finger puppet as an illustration. It's a puppet of Hillary Clinton. I picked it up over 8 years ago while traveling somewhere through the States. Like many Canadians, I was excited by the possibility of a female president of the United States. You'll remember that Donald Trump at the time still seemed like a long shot. So even on election day, many of us assumed that the polls would be right and Americans would make the sensible choice. I was so confident that I hosted a little election night party. We set up several screens around the house to watch the results come in. And I even bought a bottle of champagne to celebrate at the end. Well, as the night went on, my guests slowly dropped out one by one, and there never did come a moment to open that bottle of champagne. I put my Hillary Clinton finger puppet back on the fridge, where it's been collecting dust ever since. I felt crushed that night, and it left me with a question that continues to this day. Ever since Trump's election, my underlying question that has lingered is, how do I love my neighbor? Both sides of the political aisle have struggled with this. Whether it's Trump supporters angry with an elitist left, or progressives shocked at the statements and behavior of Trump and his supporters, neither side has understood the other. Both baffled that their opponents could be so wrong. Over the past 8 years, this divide has sharpened and solidified. When the stakes seem so high, when the other side seems so illogical, when our values are so different, how do we love? This sounds impossible. Even more impossible, Jesus called us not just to love our neighbor, but our enemy also. Pray for those who persecute you. This was our message on the Sunday before the U.S. election. And this is our same message on the Sunday after the U.S. election. I've decided to forgo focusing on the lectionary reading just to repeat this. That's how important it is. Love one another and your neighbor as yourself. In this sermon, I want to do nothing more than repeat what you have heard before, what you have heard 1,000 times, because the message, it hits differently when the context changes. I'm going to guess that our congregations are a good reflection of the Canadian population in general, so some of us will be happy with this year's election results, but most are disappointed. Disappointed might be just putting it mildly. Last Sunday, it felt like the momentum was on Harris's side and that she would maybe eke out a slim majority. In that context, for those who are opposed to Trump, loving your neighbor might have felt difficult, but possible. It was the charitable thing to do. Those poor Trump supporters would have some serious soul searching to do after they lost, so, well, we can be gracious. That was last Sunday. Today the context is very different. But the call to love is the same. With the tables turned, it's much harder to feel gracious and charitable. But it is in this context that we face the real test to discipleship. Can we love as Jesus loved? Can you love when you're on the losing side? Can you still pray for your enemy and for those who persecute you when the persecution starts to feel very real? I don't have good advice on how to do that, only a reminder that we must. As followers of Christ, this is the commitment we've made, the path we chose to walk. I remind you of your baptism. We die with Christ to be raised to new life in him. I remind you of his ministry, which was to preach good news to all people, including the scribes and the Pharisees and all of those who opposed him. I remind you of his cross and his call to carry our own and follow him. As he forgave those who trespassed against him, so must we forgive and love those we feel have hurt us. Christ's love is a self-sacrificial love. We will get hurt. We need to choose to be loving, even though we know we will be hurt. Those who may have supported Trump will feel that maybe I'm being over the top here. No one's persecuting anyone. Well, I remind you that political commentators of all stripes consistently use the language of persecution. Whether it's justified or not, every side feels that they are the ones being harmed. This is a message for all Christians. I would affirm your feelings of being persecuted, but I ask, what's next? What do we do in response to being persecuted? The world says that we should fight back. We should take up arms, go to war with our opponents, whether it's a war over territory or a war for the White House or a war over culture. Fight, resist, defend. But I ask, what would Jesus do? What did Jesus do? When he was arrested, when he was falsely accused, when they whipped and mocked him, what did Jesus do? When his enemies nailed his hands to the cross and hoisted it up, when he saw the criminals on either side and the soldiers below him, what did Jesus say? Did he change his message? Did he call on the armies of angels to descend in his defense? Did he stop loving? Well, this sounds impossible, I know. But this is how radical our love is meant to be. A self-sacrificing love. No matter what others might do, we remain the same. No matter what curses they shout at us, our message is the same. No matter what happens next, war or famine or the earth crumbling into the sea, our foundation of love doesn't move. We will not be shaken. In all things and in every context, we love, love, love. In our gospel reading today, Jesus is at the treasury at the temple, watching the crowd giving their donations. It's hard to tell what that scene would have looked like for sure, but it wasn't done quietly. Donations wouldn't be slipped into envelopes or made through e-transfers. They were very public events. People saw how much you gave, and people made a point of being seen as they gave. Jesus saw how the rich used that opportunity to flaunt their wealth. Meanwhile, a widow quietly drops in 2 small copper coins. Jesus highlights her generosity because what she gave, small as it was, cost her more than what the wealthy gave. He highlights both that her heart is in a more charitable place, but also the sacrifice that she makes in giving this donation. In the same way, God looks on our heart and sees the true sacrifice that we make when we give. When it comes to loving your political opponents, they might not see it, they might not care. Despite how much you love or how much it hurts, it might not convince them to change their opinions. You can love your enemies. That doesn't mean that they stop persecuting you. Don't be discouraged. This story about the widow reminds me that God sees what you give. God knows how hard it can be to be generous in your love, especially when we feel our generosity is being exploited. But God sees every effort that you put into loving your neighbor, big or small. Every time you try, every time you bite your tongue and hold back a snarky comment, every time you refrain from judging someone, every time you stop to listen, every time you consider the journey that your neighbor has been on, when you make those small efforts to love, God sees it. God blesses it. God will multiply it. What once seemed impossible, loving your neighbor, in God's grace can be accomplished. Just as faith can move mountains, in faith, hearts can be moved too. We dream of an impossible kingdom, a place of peace where all people love one another. This is one reason I keep the Hillary Clinton puppet. It's a reminder, or maybe a warning to me, about the importance, the international significance of being able to demonstrate love to your opponents. Clinton was admittedly never very good at that. Neither is Trump. Politicians, by the nature of their work, will always disparage their opponents. You couldn't look to them to be loving leaders. But the church needs to be different. We are not to be like the world. And the love that we are called to demonstrate, it will make all the difference. It's a love that makes our church a sanctuary, a place where all are welcomed, even when we disagree politically. That's not a safe space, but it is a loving space, where disagreements will be met with listening ears, where pain and fear can be expressed, where there remains the hope of reconciliation, even when the divide seems too wide. Whatever happens over the next 4 years, whatever will later happen when the next Canadian election happens, whenever it happens, we need to hold on to this commitment to love. At all costs, as a church, we must love. We can demonstrate for the world what God's kingdom of love will be like, a kingdom of peace for all people, even those who vote differently. Amen.